What if I told you that with a single investment, you could own a tiny piece of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Meta, and hundreds of America's biggest companies? Sounds impossible, but millions of people are already doing exactly that. And no, you don't need to be rich. You don't even need thousands of dollars to get started. Today, I'll explain the S&P 500 in the simplest way possible. By the end of this video, you'll understand why so many long-term investors pay attention to it. Imagine you walk into a grocery store. You need apples. You have two choices. The first option, buy just one apple. If that apple is rotten, you've wasted your money. Now imagine a second option. Instead of buying one apple, you buy a basket filled with the best fruits, apples, oranges, bananas, grapes, blueberries. Even if one fruit isn't perfect, the basket still has plenty of great ones. Investing works in a very similar way. Buying one company is like buying one fruit. Buying the S&P 500 is like buying the entire basket. That's why many beginners like this approach. So, what exactly is the S&P 500? The S&P 500 is a stock market index. Think of it as a list that tracks around 500 of the largest publicly traded companies in the United States. These companies come from many different industries: technology, healthcare, banking, energy, consumer products, communication, industrials. Instead of depending on just one business, you're getting exposure to hundreds of businesses. That's one reason it's often discussed when people talk about long-term investing. Every day, you'll hear people say, "The stock market went up today," or "The market crashed." But here's something many beginners don't know. Most of the time, they're actually talking about the S&P 500. Why? Because it represents roughly 80% of the total value of the US stock market. It's often used as a quick snapshot of how a large part of the US market is performing. That's why investors, news channels, economists, and businesses watch it so closely. But here's where things get interesting. Not every company inside the S&P 500 has the same importance. Apple has far more influence than many smaller companies. Why? That's exactly what we'll explain next. So, who are these 500 companies? Think about the brands you probably use every single day. If you have an iPhone, that's Apple. If you search something online, you probably use Google. If you shop online, you've likely used Amazon. If you use Windows, that's Microsoft. Watch Netflix, drive a Tesla, use Visa, drink Coca-Cola. These companies are all part of the S&P 500. That's what makes it so powerful. You're investing in businesses millions of people already use. But here's something most beginners don't know. Not every company has equal importance. Imagine 5 people trying to push a car. One person is incredibly strong. The other 4 are much smaller. If the strongest person stops pushing, the car barely moves. The same thing happens inside the S&P 500. Large companies like Apple and Microsoft have a much bigger influence than smaller companies. This is called market capitalization weighting. The larger the company, the greater its impact on the index. Let's make this even simpler. Imagine the S&P 500 is a pizza. Apple might take 2 slices, Microsoft another 2, Amazon 1 slice. Hundreds of smaller companies share the remaining slices. So if Apple has a fantastic day, the whole pizza tastes a little better. But if one tiny company has a bad day, most investors barely notice. That's why news headlines often mention Apple, Microsoft, or Nvidia. Their movements can influence the entire index. curiosity. But how does a company actually earn a place inside the S&P 500? Can anyone join? Not at all. Let's find out. Getting into the S&P 500 isn't easy. A company can't simply pay money to join. There's a committee that reviews companies using strict rules. The company must be large, publicly traded, financially healthy, and profitable over recent quarters. Only companies that meet these standards are considered. Some companies are added, others are removed, as the economy changes over time. Now let's talk about history. Many people ask, has the S&P 500 always gone up? The answer? No. Some years are excellent. Some years are terrible. Markets rise. Markets fall. That's completely normal. But historically, over very long periods, the S&P 500 has averaged roughly 10% annual returns. Remember, that's an average over decades, not every year. Past performance never guarantees future results. Here's the biggest myth. Many people think, I'll wait until the market becomes perfect. The problem? Nobody knows when that perfect moment will come. Even professional investors can't consistently predict the market. That's one reason many long-term investors focus on consistency instead of trying to perfectly time the market. So, if you can't buy the S&P 500 directly, how do people actually invest in it? Let's see. Here's something interesting. You cannot buy the S&P 500 itself because it's simply an index. Instead, you buy an ETF or an index fund. That tracks the S&P 500. Think of it like hiring someone to buy all 500 companies for you, in the correct proportions. With one purchase, you're instantly diversified. Let's quickly recap. The S&P 500 is a collection of around 500 of America's largest companies. It helps spread your investment across many businesses. Large companies have a greater influence on the index. Historically, it has delivered strong long-term average returns over decades, although returns vary and are never guaranteed. And you invest through ETFs or index funds. Simple, diversified, and beginner-friendly. Before you leave, remember this. The S&P 500 won't make you rich overnight, but learning how it works can help you make more informed investing decisions over time. This video is for educational purposes only. I'm not a certified accountant or a financial advisor. I'm also learning, and this channel is about learning and growing together. If this video helped you understand the S&P 500 subscribe to Money Decoded by Sampada Sawant.